Okay. So, good evening. I'm Andy Tomalonis, editor of The Light. I want to welcome you and let you know how thankful we are that you could join us tonight. This is a really amazing turnout. We didn't expect it. We expected to fill 50 chairs, but this is quite remarkable. Anyway, so thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for supporting and reading the New Bedford Light. Thanks also to the New Bedford Art Museum for providing this space, hosting us. And a big part of our mission as a nonprofit, nonpartisan community news outlet is to engage readers and educate them about the events, opportunities, challenges within the community. And so we do that with stories, videos, podcasts, plus we have calendar listings, civic life listings, and our regular sessions of the chat with Jack Spillane. This year we've begun this new tool for engagement, community conversations. And so we plan to have 6 of these sessions in 2024, each one focused on a different subject that we've covered with our data-driven reporting. And we're going to alternate them with arts club meetings, which we are reorganizing now, and you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, our first community conversation of the year explores the impact of climate change, which is already bringing us rising sea levels, stronger, more frequent coastal storms, and I guess there's some wind out there tonight, too. But the Light's environment and climate reporter, Adam Goldstein, recently wrapped up a series of stories on the complicated issue of rising seas, noting the damages, the costs, the need for more planning, and some ideas of what the future may bring. So this conversation tonight hopefully picks up from where Adam left off with his stories. And we have a terrific panel of experts here tonight, including Adam, who is on Zoom with us. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I'll ask a few questions myself, and then I'll open up questions to the audience, the group that are here. So.
Andy, sorry. They're having a hard time hearing in the back, so can you bring the microphone up?
I'll keep it right up close. All right. Okay. So first on the panel is Chad McGuire, professor of public policy at UMass Dartmouth with an extensive background in environmental law and science. He teaches rights and practices in the fields of environmental law, policy, sustainability, dispute resolution, and working on policy issues related to climate change, coastal management, property rights, risk perception, and land use patterns. We also have Rachel Jakuba from the Buzzards, Vice President for Bay Science at the Buzzards Bay Coalition, who oversees the coalition's research and monitoring efforts. John Bullard is the chair of the Westport Climate Resilience Committee, and he's president of the New Bedford Ocean Cluster. He's president of the board of the New Bedford Ocean Cluster. He's also an author, former mayor, and retired regional administrator for NOAA Fisheries. And John also serves on the board of the Buzzards Bay Coalition and is a co-founder of the New Bedford Light. We have Sara Grady, senior ecologist at Mass Audubon and a watershed ecologist, former South Shore Regional coordinator for the Massachusetts Bays program. And we have Adam Goldstein, who is on the big screen, but he's not here in person because he has to quarantine from an episode with COVID, which he's over, thankfully. And finally, Linda Vanderveer from the Dartmouth Natural Resources Trust had to cancel her appearance tonight, so she won't be here. But let me start. I just wanted to ask a more general question from Adam, who, you just followed up, you just gave us a brief description of the story, but I'd like it to focus on, some of the feedback we received and how do you stay a valid, hardworking communicator when there's so much misinformation out there?
I mean, it's such an integral issue, Andy, and I mean, I think there's a lot that gives me hope. I mean, just reading through some of the comments and some of the emails I received from both my sources and from, I received, emails from as far as Wareham to Rhode Island, contacting me about the story, asking me for issues about the information about the event. It's clearly something people are interested in, clearly something people are invested in, clearly something people are really watching the science on. It was really interesting for me to, go through some of those Facebook comments and, look through, people weighing some of the arguments I brought up in my story that, climate change is always naturally occurring, but it's also happening quicker. So it's really, I mean, for me at least, to not get too bogged down in it. I mean, it's just seeing people, reflect the information that's out there, that's accurate, that's useful, and really look at the issue critically, and just being able to be engaged in that, I think, is what keeps me motivated in the face of disinformation and misinformation, is seeing people take this information that's good into their own hands and stepping up and using it and applying it, and making for an informed civil dialogue on social platforms and in the town square. So.
And I had one other question. I just wanted to know, what do you think was the most interesting information that you, excuse me, what do you think was the most interesting information or the surprising information that you found when you were doing the research for this story?
Just in terms of the most, man, that's a good question. Most interesting thing I think I found, which I mean, some people already may know, is just how quickly sea level rise is accelerating. Over the past 100 years, we've seen roughly a foot of sea level rise on the East Coast, which is the equivalent to the amount we're about to see, we're projected to see over the next 30 years. So, I mean, just the rate of change is astonishing. It's clear that things are accelerating. And yeah, I mean, that was really what caught my attention and really made me realize this issue is one worth, highlighting and looking into, how can we, better prepare our communities to handle this unprecedented rates of change.
So I had a question for Rachel. So Adam's recent piece noted rising sea levels are damaging some of the salt marshes. And why are salt marshes so vulnerable to the sea rise? And
Thank you for that question. Salt marshes, they exist at the interface between the ocean and the land. So they are these places that are in the in-between. They exist where the grasses that exist on the marsh, the plants, they can tolerate being flooded with seawater twice a day, the ones on the low marsh. So these are pretty amazing plants that have this adaptation that allows them to be inundated with salt water twice a day. What that means, though, is they're right on the cusp. That's where they exist, is on that cusp, on the edge. And so when things start to change, as soon as they start to change, they're at the front lines of climate change, of sea level rise. And so while they have these amazing adaptations that allow them to be inundated twice a day with seawater, the water has to drain, otherwise the plants drown. And so because they're right at their edge, they're at this, very narrow band of a sweet spot. They're sort of a Goldilocks species, if you want to think about that, or a Goldilocks ecosystem that has to be just right. And so as soon as we start rising the sea level, we drown the plants and we make it so that they can no longer subsist. So it's really the fact that they have such a specific niche that is right on the edge of where the ocean meets the land.
right. And but they also protect the land in many ways from incoming seas, correct?
Sure, yeah. Salt marshes are an extremely valuable and a valuable ecosystem. So they perform a number of what we call ecosystem services, or things that that are valuable to people that the ecosystem does. So they can help with storm surge and flooding to sort of absorb some of that storm action and wave action. They also are really valuable for filtering both nutrients out of the water, incoming water into the bay, and also taking up carbon, so being a sink for carbon dioxide on the land to help fight climate change. And they're a really important habitat for a number of species. So I mean, you look at the marsh, you see all these birds, and there's lots of crabs. I mean, it's a very fertile ecosystem for a number of species that we value.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is for Sara. So much of the conversation around climate change and rising sea levels consists of dire warnings, and that's with good reason, but it can be a little overwhelming. So I'm hoping you can give us some good news that you share, maybe of projects that have been successful or ways that can help with the problem of rising seas.
Sure. So first of all, there is a little bit of hope in that there are people like all of us working on the coast to try to find ways to make our coasts more resilient to sea level rise and work with our coastal communities to try to figure out innovative ways to adapt. One project that we're working on right now in the ecological restoration program at Mass Audubon is looking at low-lying cranberry bogs that are connected by water to what is now tidal areas. And if you think about what Rachel was saying about how salt marshes live in this niche, in this narrow band along our coasts, as sea level rises, that marsh needs a place to go, and it can migrate inland, but we need to provide places for it to do that. Obviously, people who have coastal properties can try to allow the marsh to start to infringe upon their property some. Communities can look for places where they can have those salt marshes adapt. But one great place for future salt marsh are these low-lying coastal cranberry bogs. And many cranberry growers are looking to get out of the cranberry business. And it's this large open space. It's already a wetland. And it can be restored to then become a brackish and potentially future salt marsh.
Okay, so this question goes to John. And Westport has seen a lot of damage over the years, especially East Beach Road. But the recent storms in December and January, they seem to have brought out the notion of everybody that the climate change and the impacts are here right now, and we have to deal with them. So what is Westport doing to increase resilience now?
Thanks, Andy, and thank you all for coming out.
Yeah, it's
It's
on.
on.
It's on.
It's on.
It's
Get
on.
close to it, yep.
I read a Gallup poll a couple of days ago saying, asking what people were interested in, and there were, immigration was top, and then there were 15 other topics, and climate change didn't even make the list of the top 15. And as I look out into the crowd, did you not get that memo? This is very encouraging. So what is Westport doing? And you're right, Andy, that the 4 storms, not including today, it has taken a beating with the southeast winds. But there are a range of reactions. Not all people think the same. And what I found in working on the issue of climate change is that there is part of human nature when you give statistics and you give what Adam talked about the acceleration of a lot of trends, whether it's sea level rise or temperature, there are a lot of people who have a yearning for things to just be normal and to look out for any evidence that today is just a normal day. I learned when I worked across the interchange at City Hall that people want progress, but they don't want change. And maybe you've discovered that. And so when you ask people to change things, you get a lot of resistance. And as we talk to the people on East Beach about change, things like managed retreat, you get a lot of reactions like, well, the sea level isn't rising, we'll be fine. And so and we have a meeting Friday with a lot of state officials about what we should do with all the lots that are there. Well, actually, some of them aren't there. And so you get the reality of land that used to be there isn't there, coming up against some people's reaction that, oh, yes, they're there. And you kind of scratch your head saying, are we even seeing the same things? And we try and say, well, Nantucket is moving its sewer plant. You know, that's as real as it gets. We don't need to even have science. We just have a town not far from us that is moving its infrastructure because of this. So Westport has a climate resilience committee. I chair it. We've got dozens of people on it. And we have a water subcommittee that looks at all the issues of water, like sea level rise. And when sea level rises out in the ocean or in the river, it also rises in the groundwater. So you get salt water infiltrating wells and contaminating wells. So sea level rise has all kinds of permutations. We have an agriculture subcommittee because we're a right to farm community. You drive through Westport, you see farms. So when the air gets warmer, you're going to have the warm air carries more water. So you're going to get the hydrological cycle changing. You're going to get more rain in bursts. You're going to get more drought. You're going to get more pests coming in. You're going to get fewer pollinators. All of these are issues that are really important to an agricultural community like Westport. We have a health committee because you're going to get more days that are over 90, and you can't escape heat. But more importantly, you're going to get more nights that give you no relief. And if you have air conditioning, that's okay. You have air conditioning. But poorer people don't have air conditioning. So you're going to get more deaths. Heat kills more people than hurricanes do. And so that's an important issue that we need to think about as heat happens. And all of this is accelerating. And so we have a historic structures subcommittee because historic structures were built next to the water's edge. And so they're threatened as well. And and then we have a community engagement because we need to get everybody involved, especially young people, because of course, climate change is an issue fundamentally about intergenerational injustice. So as I learned when I worked for the federal government from a guy named David Crockett in Chattanooga, it takes us all and it takes forever. This issue isn't going away. Thank you all for being here, by the way, because you all are involved in this.
Thank you, John. So I have a question for Chad now. Despite all the evidence that people are seeing, I think one thing that is going to hit people hard is the pocketbook issues. So, some of what you deal with is very much related to that. And so, what happens when, big houses are washed away and there's not enough insurance money to rebuild them now. Maybe you could talk just a little bit about the larger scale implications for coastal communities if the federal government continues to remove coastal development and redevelopment subsidies.
Yeah, so I think to reflect what we've been talking about, if you can hear me, what most of us already know is that change is normal. We humans have a hard time accepting change, but change doesn't care about our hard time of accepting it. And sometimes we can see when humans start making changes that's really a time to start paying attention. And something that we're not familiar with is for most coastal communities in the United States, particularly places like Massachusetts, we're very low lying. Our coasts are right near the water. We're glacial till. We're the remnants of when the glaciers, moved back in the interglacial period. It's where the the stuff from the broom, if you push the broom forward and then you move it back, you know, the dust and stuff, that's what we are. That's coastal Massachusetts. Couldn't get closer to the water if we tried, right? Go up to Bar Harbor, Maine, go to England, see those big cliffs in Dover, right? And say, oh, no problem, right? Or no problem, you're up on a cliff. We don't have that luxury. Places like us, we rely a lot on federal government subsidies. We don't realize it. We're not alone. All states do. Any natural disaster, for example. You've heard this, right? Do you remember Superstorm Sandy back in 2012? Thank goodness it didn't move a bit north, right? Because if it did, Boston would have been in a lot of trouble. But you remember New Jersey, you remember New York City, the flooding of the subways, so on and so forth. Big storm. Nor'easter meets hurricane, wow, right? Sort of that perfect storm scenario. When that happened, you also might remember President Obama at the time walking hand in hand with Governor Christie in New Jersey along the beaches. And the first thing that they said, if you remember, right after the massive destruction storms is, we will rebuild, if you remember that. Don't worry, we're here, we'll rebuild. And you probably hear this a lot if you've looked at this, if you've looked at this issue. And the federal government has always been there. Since 1776, the federal government has never failed to step in when a state or a colony or an area has suffered what's considered to be a natural disaster, something above and beyond the fault of the people that they didn't cause themselves, right? You know, if you light a fire in your backyard and it ends up hitting your house and your house catches on fire, the federal government's not going to come in and say, oh, you poor thing, you know, this terrible natural disaster happened to you, let me help you. That's your fault. But if it's a hurricane or something like that, you understand, right? It's not considered to be our fault, a person's fault, a group of humans' fault. So therefore, the federal government comes in and helps out. They've been doing that a lot. And they've been doing also for places, including very wealthy individuals that live along coastlines, providing them with heavily subsidized public flood insurance. So it's two things. It's heavily subsidized, very cheap premiums for flood insurance that doesn't reflect the risk, which makes it really hard for home buyers along the coast to assess the risk of storm loss. Because if I tell the homeowner or the potential buyer, hey, this house costs $1 million, and they ask me, does it require flood insurance? I say, yes, but it only costs you $1,000 a year. They say, oh, $1,000 a year for $1 million home? That's not very expensive. That's not much of a risk. That's what we do. A lot of cognitive behavioral scientists say human beings are not rational beings. We like to pretend that we are. We're rationalizing beings. If that makes sense, that's a big difference. It's that thing called cognitive dissonance. So if I make a decision to buy a home along a coastline, and I buy that home, then I believe I did something that's really smart, a really good thing. That's what I want to believe. And so I'm going to look for evidence that tells me and reinforces the good idea that I had to buy this home. And a lot of that evidence is, hey, if somebody tells me it's $1,000 to protect this home from flood, that's cheap. I mean, the property taxes have got to be at what, $10,000, $20,000, something around there, right? So that's nothing. The federal government has spent a lot of time for very good reasons, and I don't have time to get into it, but for very good reasons, in providing subsidies, heavy subsidies, to get us to adopt a national flood insurance program. It's a public program. Hint, private insurers do not offer it. That should tell you something. Why would a company not want to offer insurance? Because they cannot charge a premium that would be actuarially sound, meaning they would charge you too high of a premium. You would say, no, I cannot afford that. There's no way I'm going to do that. And if that happened, guess what happens to the price of the home if they required flood insurance? Most people pay, not very wealthy people, but all the other people, they judge a home's cost by usually what they pay per month, say for a mortgage, you know, the all-in, right? What's it going to cost me per month to buy this home? Everybody knows mortgage rates have gone up, right? And so the carrying cost of purchasing a home is much higher. So therefore, people can afford less of a home, right? They can't afford a $500,000, they can't afford a $400,000, maybe a $300,000. Interest rates go down, maybe because they think about that monthly expense. If your insurance rates go up, right, that's one thing that the federal government is doing. What they're doing is they're moving back from that heavy subsidy. They're making you pay more of what's coming towards an actuarial premium. They're doing it very slowly and taking a very long time because they learned a very valuable lesson after Superstorm Sandy. The federal government passed a reform law on this subsidy in 2013. And the outrage from the American public was immediate. Those people that lived along the coastlines that got notices that their flood insurance rates were going up and how much they were going up said, this is ridiculous, this is crazy, we cannot have this. So the federal government didn't technically repeal that law, but the point is they put it off the books and put it on hold for a very long period. Congress did this. It's called the Bigot Waters if you want to look it up and see the history of it. And that act's still on the books, by the way. It's just over a longer period of time, they're going to slowly implement. And the federal government is also pulling back on the subsidies it provides in terms of disaster relief. Disaster relief is almost an unlimited checkbook. It's what happened, how much is it going to cost to fix this? Here's a bunch of money to do it. And it creates all kinds of strange and unusual perverse incentives. Like back in 2005, if you remember the big hurricane down in New Orleans, right? If anybody remembers that, in Mississippi and the Gulf, caused massive devastation. One of the things that we've learned through studying that is when you bring in disaster relief funds, what you bring in is a lot of resources, financial resources, but also a lot of wood, a lot of building material, and a lot of builders, and a lot of, things that make buildings. And when they're down there and just fixing what was broken, you know what they do? They look around and they say, hey, this is a nice empty spot. Since I'm here, and I've got all my builders here, and I've got all the resources here, why don't we go ahead and buy this piece of land right on the coastline, and after we're done fixing this house that was just destroyed by this hurricane, we're going to build another house right here next to it. And it creates this strange sort of cycle where you have not what's called redevelopment of what was broken, but you get overdevelopment in these sensitive coastal areas. So the only reason I say this is because we have an idea that we have a good thought process in our heads about, well, this is the way things are. This is the way it's always been. No problem. We should still keep doing things this way. When Congress starts pulling back on its subsidies, on the ability for us to keep thinking that way, we will see the difference. Even if we don't notice the estuaries or in the salt marshes, we don't notice them being gone, and we still think that a beach is there that's not there anymore, or a section of a beach is. Even if we still think that, when we get the check or the bill in the mail, I should say, right? When we get that, that's going to be a big difference, and that's coming. That's happening. And I could explain why, but it's because Congress every year appropriates a lot of money towards disaster relief, and for the past 2 decades, it has to keep appropriating more money because the disasters, the cost of the annual disasters exceed what they assumed it would be. And we simply have what's called we have a top point where it doesn't make sense anymore to keep subsidizing this process because it's only getting more dangerous, right, with sea level rise, et cetera. So it's a vicious cycle we're in right now, and it's going to be broken by the purse strings being pulled back. We're all going to see that.
I just want to do a little quick follow-up. So this is the same disaster money. Massachusetts farmers got disaster money for the flooding. Is that out of the same pool?
Comes out of the same pool, without a doubt.
And California forest fires?
California forest fires, all types of disasters that are not considered to be human-made. And by the way, if anybody caught that, there's a whole new discussion being talked about human contribution to climate change and whether or not those disasters are more like, oh no, this isn't our fault, or hey, you're the person that lit that fire in your backyard that then blew into your house, and so there's that discussion going on. And actually, even though it's not cutting off the giving of disaster relief, it is supporting the decision making for reducing it. It's creating the new way of thinking about, well, we can't do this forever. We can't keep putting up seawalls because if we do, we get rid of all the salt marshes, right? We can't put up big walls like we did here, the dike, for a good reason in New Bedford, but we can't do that everywhere, and we can't do it all the time because we lose all of those very valuable things if we do. So there's all of that, but it's all the same money, yes.
Right. Thank you. So I have a couple more questions for the panels, but I think I'd like to open up to the audience. Any questions that you have here? And Peter's on one side with a microphone, and I'm going to give up. Well, I guess we can. I don't know. I'll keep my microphone. But go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering if any communities are looking into bylaw changes that would prevent development in the velocity zone in order to create areas for flood absorption and possibly mitigate damage to some of the houses nearby.
And sorry, can one of the panelists repeat the question, or Anthony,
You guys good? Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to answer it? No, I think he's got it.
Chad, you're the expert on this. So.
No, I mean, so yes, that's right. So Massachusetts has wonderful home rule, and we have conservation commissions. We have the capacity to engage in bylaws, creating local bylaws to protect water resources or water adjacent resources. And it's different in other states, but in Massachusetts, that's the case. There are I think Woods Hole 20 years ago came out with a model bylaw for dealing with protecting areas. I think North Falmouth or Falmouth has actually enacted such a bylaw, which is a fascinating case that I know about because it's a case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was a case of, I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago where this bylaw was enacted. So you have an area of a coastal town and there's a bylaw that says, you know what, if you haven't built on this area, you can't build here anymore because it's too close to a sensitive area like the coastline. Sea level rise is happening. We're losing our coastline. So you can't build because it's going to be a buffer zone. We're going to declare this private property undeveloped part of a buffer zone, even if it's around a bunch of other homes that are developed. That's one of the examples of the bylaws that have been passed here in Massachusetts. One of the problems with that is if you bought that land, even though you haven't developed it, you bought it as a developable piece of property. So you paid in Falmouth $1 million for that half of an acre or quarter acre piece of land because you thought you could develop it. And that was the bargain, right? That's the investment backed expectation. It all makes sense, right? You wouldn't have paid that amount if you knew ahead of time, oh no, you can't develop, you can sit on it, you can play on it, but you can't develop it. You can't put a house on it, but you can, hang out there. It might be worth 1/10, 1/20th of what you paid. And that's really the issue that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And this always comes down to what's a Fifth Amendment eminent domain or a regulatory taking where a government action where they don't say we're coming in and we're going to take your property and pay you for it. That's not the case. They just make a regulation that effectively takes your property. It's called a regulatory taking versus the 10th Amendment power of the government to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizenry. And so this is the game, that the balance. And now climate change is changing that. It used to be that if a government created a regulation like this, they'd have to pay you for it. But now, if the government's basis, this also happened in, what is the Florida Keys? You know the Florida Keys at the very end of Florida? There's a number of those small islands. They have bridges that carry, right, so that you can get to one of the farthest out islands. The bridge has been subsumed by sea level rise. It's basically, and they said, government, come in and rebuild the road. And government said, no, we're not rebuilding because we can't. We cannot rebuild it. It's too expensive. We'll have to rebuild it again in 5 years or in 3 years. It's a non-deal. And of course, the landowners sued because now they can only access their properties by boat. They said, hey, what's the deal here, government? You can't not provide access. And the answer is, yes, they can under the 10th Amendment, brand new. In this case, in the Falmouth case, I went up to U.S. Supreme Court. This Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, our largest court, our Supreme Court, said, 10th Amendment, it's okay, you can do that, which is fascinating. That's one of the first cases in the country where we're now saying that climate change, regulating for climate change is a police power of the state. And they can go so far as to reduce. I know this probably scares some coastal owners, right? But this is what's happening. See, this is my point. We can be as irrational as we want to be about how we think about things, but the people that are paying, they're saying, no, we can't keep doing this because it's not working and it's not a solution. It's not a solution to keep doing these things. So that's when we really, in my opinion, internalize what's going on. Unfortunately, that's always in the 11th hour or something,
One of the things we're contemplating on East Beach, on the south side of the road, is raising some money to do a voluntary program with the Buzzards Bay Coalition, where we would offer homeowners money to sell their property, perhaps with a life tenancy, that where the property would go to the town. And what we're saying, and the homeowner's initial reaction is, no, we want to stay here forever. We don't want to sell. And what I'm saying is, okay, but when Mother Nature takes your property, you can argue with her about getting compensation. And we'll see how that goes. Or we can discuss with you a fair price and you can stay there for the rest of your life. And it'll go to the town. Now you can judge which is a better deal. And that may shift the equation a little bit.
Oh, okay, so next question. When you get the microphone, you have to push it right up into your mouth like I'm doing now. And also, please state your name if you can.
Mainly for Adam. How long will it take for the insurance on waterfront property or floodplain property to get to market price on the rate that it's rising?
I think what'll happen is it'll never get to market rate for full insurance. What they'll do is they'll limit the exposure to X amount of dollars. So, if anybody so they'll say the premium will get closer to market premium, but for insuring a maximum of $200,000 of loss, for example. And, by the way, public flood insurance does that. It has a limit. The backdrop to that, though, what always exceeded the limit was national disaster relief. So disaster relief would catch up to, if you had flood insurance, not many people do, but if you did have it, it would cover a certain part. And then what would step in was federal disaster assistance. I think to John's point, it's, hey, next time your house goes, there's not going to be federal dollars there like you think there is to rebuild your house. And it's not going to be the Three Little Pigs scenario, or is it the three, at first it was, hey, now we're going to rebuild it to make it stick, stronger. And then stick gets destroyed. Now we're going to rebuild it to make it, brick or steel and we're going to raise it off the ground and, so on and so forth, which gets very expensive. And this has been done. It's been done in Massachusetts. There's a property on the right, in Massachusetts Bay that's been redone, I think, over the past 20 years, 5-6 times on taxpayer. It takes taxpayer money. When we say federal government, it's taxpayer dollars. That's what that is. But so I think to answer your question explicitly, I think what happens is they put a cap. They raise the rate for that cap because you're not even paying close to that, right? So they raise your insurance rate towards what you said, the market rate, the fair market value for that cap. And then there's nothing else. You have it, good for you, but there's nothing else. The weird thing about flood insurance really quickly is that often if you buy a house in the flood zone, significant flood hazard area, a certain flood zone, you're required, if you're getting a mortgage, you're required to get flood insurance. But nobody ever checks with you after the first year, right? So people often, the average tenure of flood insurance for most is 2 years. After 2 years, they let it lapse. And the worst thing that can happen, according to what our research shows, research that's been done on this, not my research, the worst thing that happens is when you actually have a big flood loss. The moment after you have it, everybody that's had the flood loss, they go, great, we're done. Because it's a 1 in 100 year chance or a 1 in 50, in their minds, they think, oh no, it's not going to happen for another 100 years. I'm good. You know what I mean? It happens. So let go of the flood insurance, let go of that. Let's save some money. The bad thing has happened. So weird things. We engage in very strange behaviors. Again, going back to my cognitive dissonance comment before.
More questions? Thank you. John, I'd like to follow up on what you raised about East Beach, and it gets to a larger question, which I have. I live in Dartmouth, and I'm curious as I hear the federal government pulling back, being less stupid in their funding of high-risk areas. What about those of us who are not on the coast? If there is not federal money to fix a causeway or a bridge, a road surface that really falls to the obligation of the town, are all the taxpayers in that town going to be funding that? And secondly, with that risk in mind, are the towns like Dartmouth, Westport, New Bedford starting to reserve funds for the inevitable cost increases caused by climate change? Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question. And what we're trying to do, and I'll just speak for Westport, is to identify as comprehensively as we can all of the risks to the town that we can think of, from heat, from sea level rise, etc., to infrastructure, to agriculture and so on, and then prioritize for various stakeholders. The town would be one stakeholder because, as you point out, the town has to deal with roads, among other things. And then the citizens have to deal with things. If you're looking at sea level rise contaminating wells and septic systems, then that's of interest, not just to people who live on the coast, but lots of people. So what we're trying to do is imagine every risk there is, storms, heat, you name it, and then understand who is affected by those risks. It's certainly the town, but it's also lots of citizens and businesses. And then prioritize and give reports so the town can start to figure out, well, how do we deal with roads? Which are the low-lying roads? Which are the roads that are escape routes for people? Things like that. So when they get Chapter 90 money or, you know, the funds they use to repair roads, they can start to figure out which roads they apply to. Or when there are extraordinary investments, such as ARPA funds that have come in the last few years, they can say, here's where we want to make these investments. I have said on a number of occasions, probably because I'm biased as a former mayor, that local officials are really the only people I can think of that routinely think in 50 and 100-year time frames. You know, businessmen folks thinking, you know, what's going to be the next quarter or the next 2 quarters. But when you're planning a school, you're thinking about 100 years. When you're digging into a road for a water line or a sewer line, you know that that's got to last 100 years. So local officials have the same time frame that climate change does. So they're planning with long-term time frames. And so I think they're at least from that standpoint thinking about where do I want to invest on the question you asked about, you know, which roads need attention now from that are going to be affected by sea level rise or increasing severity of storms.
But the reality is everyone living in that town, in the absence of having the town reserved for that, will be taxed in effect for those improvements.
Climate change is not going to be free. It is going to exact a cost, but there are also opportunities because as you, and this is what you were getting at, Sarah, we have the ability to meet this challenge. And this challenge is going to create jobs. When you talk about how to weatherize houses, how to put solar panels on houses, you can't offshore putting solar panels on houses. I see Catherine Duff in the back there. You know, if you're creating energy efficient houses, you're not going to offshore that to China, right? That has to be done locally. These are jobs that are going to be created here. And so as we tackle this, and, you know, I'm involved in the New Bedford Ocean Cluster. Our mission is how do we increase the number of local jobs from all the activity that's going on off the South Terminal with wind turbines. You know, how do we maximize the jobs being created as a new industry is blooming in the Port of New Bedford? There are economic opportunities that come out of this as well.
Okay, go ahead.
My name is Paula Robinson Deere, and my husband and I have a property along West Beach in New Bedford. And I was wondering, what can we expect in terms of sea level rise over the next 30 years?
Over the next 30 years, let's see, I'm trying to think. It's about a foot, yeah, within the next 30 years. May I ask what your property is like? Is it sloped against where the water is? Is it flat?
The beach in front of us has an 8-foot wall, and then we have a 30-foot rise, so we're set back pretty high.
Yeah, so not seeing the property, obviously. If you have a beach in front of that wall, you probably will not have beach in front of that wall anymore. You'll probably end up with maybe a little sliver at a low tide and lots of waves crashing against the wall at high tide. But sounds like you're at least high enough that it wouldn't be reaching you every day.
Can I also ask, when we first bought the property about 8 years ago, we had to watch a flood insurance piece, and they showed the tides rising about 18 feet, which came up across the street to the bottom of the wall where we are. But the concern isn't so much the rise, and I'm just sort of checking to make sure that the tides aren't rising faster than what we anticipated, but the storm surges and the winds and the possible damage to the property. How do we begin to think about that?
Right, so there are a lot of factors that affect the water level. You may have heard the term sunny day flooding, which would refer to areas where just the daily tide is higher. Those high tides are higher. On top of that, when we have storms, we have storm surge on top of that, as well as the additional wave energy that comes from those storms, which is would accelerate the water upward in that velocity zone. And there's also a 19-year cycle called the metonic cycle, which is actually an astronomical effect. And we are currently on a rise as far as the metonic cycle is concerned. So over, I think it peaks, I'm trying to think, it was peaking 2014, I think, was the last peak. So, we're kind of coming out of a low point and coming up into, over the next 10 years, coming up into a higher water level. So all of those things compounded, that's going to increase that acceleration that was referred to earlier.
So are we still talking about a foot, or are we looking at more like 2 or 3 feet?
So NOAA. So you can go to like NOAA website, and you can just type in flood, map my flood area, and you type in your address. They've updated their flood maps in the last 2 years. They've incorporated more climate change. So you'll see they have an old line called an SA, I think, and now the new is VA. But none of that matters. You can just type in your property and see what a presumed flood surge would look like, an average flood surge, and whether you're in that flood hazard zone. Yeah.
Over here. Okay. I'm going to give her my microphone.
I'm Piper, and I was just wondering what's a positive policy or change you have seen in the South Coast in regards to the climate change and sea level rise?
So who's best to answer that question?
Well, I think I look at the planning that's going on, for example, in the city of New Bedford. And it is comprehensive, detailed, implementation going on, from big things like renewable energy through wind turbines, planting of thousands of trees, and other things. I find that encouraging. I see what's going on in Westport with trying to marshal a community around the issue of climate change, breaking a big issue like resilience into manageable parts, and then getting lots of people to, it's like digesting an elephant for dinner, right? You got to get it into digestible parts and then get people working on it. So I see the turnout here as really encouraging. So I think I find a lot of reasons to be encouraged about this.
Thank you.
You're here.
I just want to add, so this is not an example of a policy, but it's an example of projects. And there are a number of projects that, towns and nonprofits and organizations all around the South Coast are doing to try and combat the effects of sea level rise. So Sara talked about, the idea of restoring low-lying cranberry bogs. There's also a number of, the Buzzards Bay Coalition does a lot of work to protect land behind existing salt marshes. So again, to create, to make sure that there's area for the marshes to migrate into over time as sea level rises. And also we're working, as a number of organizations are, to preserve the marshes that we have. So looking at techniques where we're already seeing the impacts of sea level rise on our marshes. And one of those impacts that we see is water getting standing water on the marsh, getting stuck, and being able to create a drainage from that water so that the water can drain and the marsh grasses can regrow. So there is a lot of work happening. Not a lot of it's not necessarily policies, but it's organizations around the South Coast trying to do what we can to, to mitigate the impacts of sea level rise.
Andy, could I really quickly too? Sure. Just on that point. So a lot of the ways in which we think that cities right now, like Boston, for example, a lot of it has a lot of engineering to it. We call it resilience. We want to make ourselves more resilient. That pretty much goes back to, I think, what John said earlier about human beings, wanting everything not to change. So what we have, we should keep at a minimum, and let's just change the way we have it. So you see in Boston, for example, to take the HVACs, what they're doing, part of the resiliency planning is taking HVAC systems from, large, they're no longer in the basement. They'll put them up, 4th, 5th floor, and they're using the first floor and the first or second floor in their designs or retrofits to be just open. They're kind of like the houses on stilts theory. Even though it's a building, they'll just open the doors and let the water run through and then back out. So there's this mindset from this early sort of resiliency planning from a policy standpoint that really talks about stay, armor, figure out a better way to deal with the water, but stay where you are. One of the problems with that for the South Coast is that we're very low-lying, and if we look at the ocean, most of our Buzzards Bay, anything that faces the ocean water, we've done a lot of armoring. I did a research project on this about 5 or 6 years ago that I published. We've done tons of armoring on our open faces, things that look out to the ocean. We put up things like seawalls. That's what I mean by armoring, right? Like hard structures. We put up things like they call revetments or jetties, groins. The things that go sideways so that when the water, so the beach doesn't get eroded in that area, it just erodes the beach to the next door neighbor. So you get sand on yours, but unfortunately your neighbor doesn't have any sand. You know what I'm talking about, right? We've done a lot of that, but what we haven't done is in the, so the rivers, the estuarine rivers. You think about all those, the Westport River, the Slope, all of those major rivers that we have that run in, that take in salt water during high tide, and push out some fresh water there as those places are just perfect areas for protection for exactly what's being talked about here. And the reason why is because those salt marshes are incredibly valuable and important, not just as an ecosystem service, but they become a regulating service, a protection that would cost us a lot of money if we were to try to build that kind of protection against the effects of storm surge, the amount of carbon they take up. They provide us with a lot of good things that we would love. It's like the you know the Quabbin Reservoir? Boston's got really good water, right? What is that? That's just a bunch of land that we just, right? We dammed up and we said, just let that land. But what filters the Quabbin? Same thing for New York City, right? You go to the Catskills. What filters that water is just nature. And it would cost the equivalent, I think for New York City, it's $3-4 billion a year. If they had a water treatment plant that had to actually clean the water for New York City, but nature does that for that. So these salt marshes are very much like that regarding climate change. They give us billions and billions of dollars worth of value. We're just not aware of it. But we really should think from a policy perspective, start moving from those sort of like, let's stay and, and build bigger and stronger and just smarter, and think about the idea of let's maintain some of these other things and give them space to breathe, because they do. As the water rises, they need to move.
Can I just add to that? So one action that's taking down infrastructure that I know Buzzards Bay Coalition has done quite a bit of is dam removal. And you don't think of dam removal as being something that has anything to do with sea level rise, but if you're taking away dams that are at the head of tide or near the future head of tide, you're increasing the ability of those marshes to not only migrate inland from the, up onto your lawn sort of direction, or a local parking lot, but you're also increasing their ability to move upstream. So there are places that are not areas where marshes are now that, if a dam were to be removed, could become future marsh. And in a lot of cases, we're not necessarily thinking about, well, we are, but not always thinking about those places as being our future coast, to your point.
Okay, thanks. Next question, Peter. Do you have somebody?
Yeah, I've got three, actually four.
Good evening. My name is Michael Moore. I live in Marion. I'm one of those villains that pays taxes on waterfront. And I see the taxable salt marshes that we have eroding and falling apart. And so my question is, from the ecologists on the panel, do you give any advice about how to cultivate lowland so it's ready to become the next salt marsh? And if that advice is around, how does that jive with the Wetlands Protection Act?
Rachel, I think that's you.
Sure, both Sarah and I can speak to that. So this is actually a really active area of research, is how do we, make that new marsh, how do we facilitate that marsh migration? And so there's a number of projects actually that Mass Audubon's working on one right near a marsh that we study, Ocean View Farm, trying to, where there's a marsh and there's a low-lying farm behind it. And part of the reason that farm is no longer, in cultivation is to prepare the way for the marsh. And so they've looked at, maybe I should let you, do you want to talk? No, okay. They've looked at planting specific species of grasses that are more tolerant to salt inundation. What we see as, just in the sites I measure around Buzzards Bay, so we have 12 sites that we've been measuring for 5 years. And there are sites where I can, into the forest, I'm seeing salt marsh species creeping further than they did before, because the water's, it's coming. And so there is a certain amount of natural progression, but there is active research right now on trying to figure out what are the best ways to facilitate that marsh migration, because the change is happening so rapidly that the concern is that the change is happening so rapidly that the natural progression needs some help. And so it's looking at, trying to plant species to prepare the way, also in some ways sometimes to create some sort of, small channels of the water up into the area to sort of facilitate the salt water starting to come up and allowing it to get infiltrated and start the transition.
And to your point about the Wetlands Protection Act, Mass Audubon is currently in a fit of advocacy, I would say, with a lot of salt marsh scientists trying to work with Mass DEP to work with the way our Wetlands Protection Act is really strict in Massachusetts. We have one of the strictest Wetlands Protection Acts in the country, which is great if someone's trying to ruin a coastal wetland or any sort of wetland, but ironically kind of gets in the way when you're trying to do a restoration project. So if your restoration technique involves mowing the grass and putting it in a ditch so that it helps the hydrology of the marsh, why is that not fill? You know, if you are cutting a small channel to drain the marsh, why are you not dredging that marsh? And so we're kind of up against almost a discussion of vocabulary in trying to do what is good within the context of the regulations. And so we're trying to work with Mass DEP to determine how we can approach restoration and do it quickly without too much, to be honest, red tape, and get these projects done. So I would say probably keep your ears open for things like writing letters and stuff like that.
Okay, next.
Hi, I just want to ask, the wind farm terminal was built with, I assume, taxpayer dollars as well as dollars from the wind farm companies. Was that responsible to build that in a flood zone?
I think if you're talking about the Marine Commerce Terminal, is that what you're talking about? The Marine Commerce Terminal was built with, is that what you're talking about? Yeah. The Marine Commerce Terminal was built with $100 million state dollars. And then it is, and it's owned by the state Commonwealth and leased to the, right now to Vineyard Wind 1. So it is a state facility. It is not improved with private dollars.
But the real question I'm asking is, because it's in the known flood zone, is that a responsible use of our funds?
Well, are you suggesting, I mean, it's always been a bulkhead there. Are you suggesting that it should have been returned to wetland?
I'm just asking if that's a responsible use of the land and the funds that were put into that facility, knowing that the seas are going to rise.
Well, I think so. It's as you know, inside a hurricane barrier. So I think it's going to be protected for quite a long time from rising.
So then, given that, then won't all the properties within the hurricane barrier also be protected?
Yes.
Does everybody know that?
I don't know if everybody knows that, but I think
This is news.
I don't think it's news that the hurricane barrier is going to protect against sea level rise for quite a while. I mean, the doors to the hurricane barrier are going to open and close a lot more frequently, but they're going to protect. For example, Rachel talked about the loss of marshes, which in Buzzards, well, everywhere, is going to be a tremendous loss. But the coalition is doing a huge project on Marsh Island up in New Bedford Harbor, right? You can see it as you drive on 195. And that may be a marsh that stays a marshland longer than others because of the hurricane barrier.
Thank you.
Hello. Okay, my name is Skyla. Thank you for being here. My question is, what do you think is the role in environmental justice in all of this work, specifically sea level rise work?
I think that is a really excellent point, and it's something that I think has been difficult to sensitively employ in a lot of efforts. I think there's a lot of one-way activity that occurs where organizations try to integrate environmental justice, but it becomes a bit transactional, and people are chosen to represent an environmental justice community without those services being rendered back to those communities. I think that the first step to that is really listening to those communities, to say, we've acknowledged that you are going to be disproportionately impacted by things like sea level rise, and becoming better listeners, going into those communities and asking, what are your concerns? What would you like to see happen? And what are your priorities? Because I know I've been part of many different prioritization efforts where it's been a group of 50 plus people who all look like me and have the same sort of privilege that I have had, deciding what the priorities of environmental justice communities should be, without the voices of those communities being the ones driving the action. So I think that's really the first step, is becoming better listeners.
Skylar, you and I have talked about this issue at length. I think if you look at this globally, there are nations that will be underwater, and they are nations of color who have contributed zero to the issue that will put them underwater. Countries that will vanish from the face of the earth through no fault of their own. I mean, this is a profound issue of environmental injustice when you look at it globally, and it's one of the stumbling blocks as the IPCC tries to negotiate how first world countries should compensate third world countries for this injustice. I mean, how do you relocate a country? Pretty basic questions like that. When you narrow the geographic scope and bring it home, as it were, that principle still applies, that people who contribute most to the problem seem to suffer less. The New Bedford Ocean Cluster has, our mission is to advance 4 areas: commercial fishing, offshore wind, aquaculture, and marine technology. And what we spend most of our time the first 2 years is offshore wind. And what we spend most of our time on that is how to maximize the amount of local jobs. And in that, what is local jobs? It is our effort, is our community is made up of various parts. And I spend a lot of time with Buddy Andrade and others in how do we reach into the minority community and groups like the ILA, which is a Cape Verdean waterfront union that's been on the waterfront for, 100 years or more, to be part of what is going on the waterfront now with offshore wind. Because what is the point of having offshore wind be a job generator if if you drive down there, you'll see a lot of trucks with Texas license plates. If it's not And by the way, I want to credit New Bedford Light. This is a New Bedford Light deal here tonight, isn't it, Andy? Yeah. Oh, it is. Yeah, I thought so. For writing an article about, how Vineyard Wind was doing in meeting its job targets. That we want local jobs. Now, it's not easy because this is a brand new industry and they know how to build energy things in Texas and Louisiana a lot more than we do. So, you can't just snap your fingers and say, yeah, we'll provide all the workers here in New Bedford because we don't know how to do this yet. So it's not an easy problem to solve, but it is something that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to do, is how to answer your question, Skylar. Good question.
Andy, can I really quick can I just add a quick thing to that? So the context that I often think about is we think about resource allocation. We don't have unlimited dollars. I know people think that because the US government can print money, that it can just print unlimited dollars. It's not true, because we just have runaway inflation and everything costs a lot more. So there is an absolute limit, right, to the amount of dollars. We don't have the dollars to do everything we want to do. So when we think about disaster relief, for example, we can look at, or even spending the money to help develop the terminal, right, to have a public terminal. The fact that we have that barrier makes a difference because it changes the calculus, which says that even when a public entity wants to make a new school, it says, well, this school, if we build it out of this, it should last 30 years, right? Out of 30, 50 years. We have a time frame on the return on investment. For the next 30 to 50 years, this building should be good for this purpose. The fact that we have the dike affects the things that are in the harbor for their usable life. Because maybe without the dike, it's like every category 2 or 3 hurricane that we get is going to cause significant flooding. But with the dike, it's got to be a category 4 or category 5 to make any difference. And what's the likelihood, right? So the money the value we can create in the in-between period might outweigh the cost of the repairs, etc. So it might be a good idea. But from an environmental justice standpoint, we can ask ourselves, when we distribute money, and there's not enough money to go around to do all the things we want to do, when we distribute it freely to people that suffer damages along coastlines, for example, after a hurricane, how equitable is that distribution? That money could be used for some other purpose. Is this the best use of that money? Or giving high subsidies to people for flood insurance? The weird thing, by the way, that I haven't mentioned, if you look at our coastlines and you look at a home that's on our coastline and it's a home of a certain size, and you look at a home that's exactly the same as that home, but it's 1 mile inland, which home is more valuable? Which home would cost more? Raise your hand if you say it's the coastal home. You pay more for the coastal home, right? Everything's the same between the two homes. Same footprint, half an acre, whatever, right? It's just one is along the coast and one's inland. We pay a premium to live in dangerous coastal areas when it's the coastline. But if we move inland to the middle of the country, the cheapest land, the cheapest properties are built in flood zone areas, river flood zone areas. So when you have a flood from a river, the people that are suffering from that flood damage are usually the people that have no other choice. They're buying the best home that they can in that area. It's usually the cheapest property. Isn't that a weird thing? It's weird that we have this juxtaposition. So we give a high preference to coastal areas. But the point is, we can ask that question. In internal areas, maybe it makes all the sense in the world, right? From an equity standpoint, to say people that can least afford to take on that loss themselves should be fully compensated by the federal government and backed up. That might make sense. But people that are more capable of dealing with some of that loss themselves, why are we spending limited dollars there when we can be doing it somewhere else? So there's something we've been talking about where there's an environmental justice component to it in terms of how we spend our money.
Okay, Peter, you had somebody back here?
So speaking of environmental justice, there are a lot of jobs tied up with the windmills and fishing. Somebody up here said that the sea level is going to rise maybe a foot in the next 30 years. In 30 years, all 1,000 of the windmills they're going to put up out on Cox's Ledge, which is a sensitive fishing area, are going to be obsolete. It'll be time for them to come down. What's the environmental justice impact and compensation for the people who fish out there and everyone else who uses those waters?
fishery.
John, do you want to handle that from a NOAA perspective?
Well, there's several questions in your question. And as Andy said, I used to work for NOAA. And I'm not going to give a NOAA position, but I am supportive of offshore wind. I am not a supporter of locating wind turbines on Cox Ledge. I think that's not a smart place to do that. And I think actually that NOAA has communicated to BOEM that that's not a very sensible place to put wind turbines. I know. Well, I know when I was at NOAA, BOEM didn't, they always listened to NOAA. They didn't always do what NOAA suggested. We advocated for fishermen. We advocated for fish. BOEM was always polite to NOAA, but they didn't always do what NOAA suggested they do. So they're different agencies with different missions. Our mission was to protect fish and fisheries. That's not BOEM's mission. So, and I think that's NOAA's position now is not to locate wind turbines on Cox's Ledge. But as I say, NOAA and BOEM are different agencies. So, but I'm not sure I understood about, they have set up mitigation funds. Gordon, isn't there a meeting coming up very soon?
And if you're talking about the Vineyard Wind Fisheries Mitigation Fund, I believe there's a meeting on March 21st. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah.
So there's a meeting on March 21st to discuss Vineyard Wind 1's fisheries mitigation program, which they're just beginning to launch. Launching in our offices at the Port Authority, 123 Park Drive, to really quick thing. To try to explain the process for participating in that mitigation program. Now that is a one-off related to the Vineyard Wind project alone. So as we all know, there are going to be literally dozens of these offshore wind projects. So there are efforts underway to do a more comprehensive mitigation program. Right now, the way it's set up, mitigation generally goes to the state most proximate to the wind development. Well, I think everybody knows there's vast wind developments in the New York Bight that are being planned that may be 40 miles from New Jersey, but the vast majority of the fishing in the New York Bight comes here. So there's a lot of discussion about how to do really equitable mitigation on where the impacts actually are. That is underway and is a longer project than the Vineyard Wind 1 mitigation, John, that you're referring to.
Why mitigate something you don't have to break in the first place?
Yeah, so BOEM generally, when they're reviewing these projects, they have, it's AMM, I think, if I get that right, which is avoid, minimize, mitigate, and monitor when it comes to commercial fisheries. They kind of skip the first two so far in some of the filings and some of the conversation, which is a lot of what we've been advocating for. And I know we're getting away from resiliency a little bit and a little bit more heavy into offshore wind, so I'm sorry about that. But yeah, we also are advocating very strongly for avoidance wherever possible. One of my frustrations is that the countries of Iceland and Norway that are getting into offshore wind, the first thing they did was map their fisheries. And then they looked for areas for offshore wind. It's not how we did it here. And that's why we're now trying to play catch up on what those impacts are going to be and how to minimize them as much as possible.
That is Gordon Carr, who's head of the New Bedford Port Authority.
Test 1, 2. Hi there, Jamie Jackward from Dartmouth. Question for both Andy and for Adam. Now that you are writing more in the climate space, are you considering getting into talking about things like tipping points within climate as well as ocean acidification? I think the first issue is certainly one that could drastically change some of the forecasted numbers that we're talking about here, and I don't know that a lot of people are aware of that, and certainly acidification has huge impacts potentially on our fisheries.
I was going to say the tipping point thing. Yeah, I mean, that's something I really found out about actually a lot through the most recent responses to this article. I heard from an oceanographer emeritus at the University of Rhode Island, Haraldur Sigurdsson, and he spoke to the fact that, we're looking at the Woods Hole tide gauge, which is really, that's kind of the barometer for, sea level rise in Massachusetts. You can go online, look at the tide gauge. You'll see there's a sea level rise little, tab that you can click on and essentially track the past year. We're looking at a little less than a foot over the past 30 years. You can also click into that, app, I guess what it is, and you can look at how the sea level rise, curves will adjust in the coming years based on various IPCC representative concentration pathways. So like emissions pathways, economic pathways, et cetera. The tipping point thing though, I mean, really we're looking at a linear curve. The engineers at Woods Hole have drawn a linear curve, but in the past 10 years or so, that curve's become more parabolic. So we're consistently seeing sea levels at a higher level than, predicted by the curve that we're looking at. So it's definitely something I'm interested in pursuing a story on, in the coming days. I feel like I've been telling that to everyone, including Rachel, and that just give me 1 sec, I'm going to get to it. But it's definitely something that I'm really interested in doing a story on. And what was the other part of the question? I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the second half. Oh, ocean acidification. Yeah, I know that's a real focus of NOAA right now in their Milford lab in Connecticut. I haven't really looked into that as much, given it's out of state. And I've been speaking with a couple of local people here. I mean, the effects of ocean acidification seem to be, they're prevalent and they're, shrinking the size of certain species, but there's also a lot of shell debris at the bottom of the ocean. So, I mean, scientists are, it's still up in the air as to how much of an effect ocean acidification will have versus ocean warming, which I did a story on a little while ago, the start of the year, which is, really also having a major impact on, local species of fish. So
I can speak to the ocean acidification issue. I was on the Governor's Commission for Ocean Acidification a couple of years ago. So I did a lot of research into and commentary on ocean acidification. And what's interesting for us here on the coast, I mean, there's ocean acidification happening out in the middle of the ocean. It's sort of much like the discussion of climate change globally. It kind of feels a little bit distant. But within the context of that, there's also coastal acidification, which is ocean acidification plus what we are doing to our coastal waters. The good news, I like giving you some good news. Good news thing number one is that one of the primary drivers that makes coastal acidification worse is actually nutrient inputs, and that's something that we can control. So, everything from reducing the fertilizer on your lawn, not having a lawn, things like improving wastewater outputs so that they're not causing as much increased nutrients in our coastal waters will also help with coastal acidification. The other really interesting thing is that there's been a lot of work looking into co-growing seaweeds like kelp along with shellfish. And it's actually a really perfect partnership because the coastal acidification hurts the shellfish, but the presence of the kelp actually provides a greater protective effect than if those shellfish were being grown alone. Plus, it's very economically sound because the kelp industry is the opposite season from the oyster industry. So it provides a year-round income for shellfish growers to integrate kelp into their growing industry.
Adam, I remember when I worked in Woods Hole back in 2012, talking to Scott Doney, who then worked for Hui and was the expert in ocean acidification. And he said, John, I would love to come to New Bedford and talk to members of the scallop industry because they're impacted by ocean acidification. So I think it's a story of interest to New Bedford, ocean acidification in the scallop capital of the world. So I would say that's a good story to look at.
It's on our list. A limited number of reporters, of course, and so many interesting subjects to chase after. So I do want to say that we'll have time for just a couple more questions, and then there's food here, and you can come take a look at the exhibit here. So we're going to break this up in just a few minutes. It's a little after 7:30 now, but by 7:45, we should probably start. Go ahead.
I'm Gina Pertel, and my question has again to do with jobs. And the area I'm most interested in is the non-industry jobs. So to the extent that climate change crosses so many sectors of life on Earth, it seems that that we are placing an inordinate amount of attention in kind of more of the same of industrial applications and things that really support a paradigm, a model that we know and we keep repeating, and not always to the best. And so I would like to know what comments you might have about the need for more parity in a sense of looking at climate change and the workforce around resilience and equity and everything else, and where job development could be attended to.
John, you want to talk to that from Ocean Cluster experience?
I think of what we have to do to change the way we're living. And I see opportunity, and I hope that's what you're getting at. And I think of the New Bedford Ocean Cluster and what we're trying to do in diversifying the economy of New Bedford, which had some success as a one-industry town in the days of whaling, and then as a one-industry town in the days of textiles. And I guess you become a diversified economy when the one industry in a one-industry town leaves. We're diversified. And so we've been the top dollar port in fishing for 20 years or more. And I used to count that when I was regional administrator at NOAA. And, New Bedford's number one, and I tried to look at who was number two, and there wasn't even really a number two. We were number one by a lot. And so the ocean cluster is looking, and credit goes to Mayor Mitchell for seeing this, we have a dominant position there, but we need to diversify. And so offshore wind is one way to do that. And what is happening in New Bedford with offshore wind coexisting with fishing. Now, that doesn't mean every fisherman likes offshore wind, because they don't. Every fisherman doesn't think the same about what day of the week it is. Fishermen fish because they're fiercely independent people, and they think differently about everything. But there are a lot of fishermen in New Bedford who think, hey, here's another way we can make some money. We can sell fuel to offshore wind just the same way we can sell fuel to fishing boats. You know, our electronics, our hydraulics, even the harvesters are finding ways that they can make money in offshore wind. That is different than in New Jersey, in New York, in Maine. But in New Bedford, they're seeing, hey, there are opportunities here. A third focus area is aquaculture. And when I worked at NOAA, aquaculture was the fastest growing area. I mean, we realized that 200 years ago that putting meat on the table by shooting rabbits and bunnies wasn't the most efficient way to put meat on the table. We figured that out on land 200 years ago, but we still, in fishing, do wild harvest. And in our region, lobsters and scallops are each $500 million industries. The third is blue crab down in Chesapeake, 80 million. I mean, it's third by a long, long way. Aquaculture is 267 million and growing like topsy. So this is a real growth area. And the other thing about aquaculture is every meeting I went to in aquaculture, everyone in the meeting is like 30, early 40s. I go to fish meetings and everyone's my age, you know? And so it's young people and it's growing like crazy. And so there's real opportunity there. And then marine technology is our fourth area. And that's the one that links everything together. So this is a way to diversify the port's economy, and diversification is one way you achieve resilience, right? Because if you have a table with 8 legs, it's more resilient than a table with 2 legs or 3 legs. So I think that there are a lot more jobs if you've got a lot going on in a lot of different areas. And they can be big businesses like offshore wind, and they can be small businesses like someone growing kelp, as you talked about. You know, if you've got a lot going on and they're feeding off of each other and they're reinforcing each other and they're networked together, then you've got resilience happening. They're talking to one another. I think that's a recipe for excitement, and I think it's a recipe for resilience. And I used to give a lot of Al Gore talks on sustainable development. My last slide was always a picture of whichever town I was giving a talk on, the local team, whether it's field hockey or whatever, of the people after a victory smiling. And I said, look at the smiles on these people's faces. You know why they're smiling? Because they achieved a victory. You know how they achieved a victory? They set high goals, they practiced, they worked as a team, and they achieved a victory. They get to wear those smiles. You know who doesn't get to wear the smiles? The people in the stands. You got to be in the arena to wear these smiles. Well, that's the same with what we're doing here with resilience, right? Climate change is tough, right? You don't get to, we're going to win, we're going to achieve it, but only if you're in the arena. Only if you're in the arena, then you get to wear the smiles, not if you're in the stands.
Thank you. So I think I'd like to wrap up here with this. You can talk to the panelists individually. There's food in the back. There's a cash bar here. So, and restrooms are downstairs. So thank you so much for coming. Enjoyed the question.
On their website. Welcome.
It was great.